June 15, 1944, 7:45 p.m. Joe DiMaggio walked into his Manhattan apartment and found his best friend Phil Rizzuto kissing his wife Dorothy Arnold on the couch. The betrayal that destroyed Joe's marriage, ended his closest friendship, and nearly broke the greatest baseball player of his generation had been going on for months right under his nose. This is the story of the most painful betrayal in baseball history, how Joe DiMaggio's perfect life was shattered by the two people he trusted most, and why he never spoke to Phil Rizzuto again. It started 6 months earlier, December 18, 1943. Joe DiMaggio was having the worst year of his life. He had been drafted into the Army and was stationed at Santa Ana Air Base in California. The war had taken him away from baseball, away from New York, and away from his wife Dorothy. Dorothy Arnold was a beautiful actress who had starred in several Hollywood movies. She was blonde, glamorous, and used to being the center of attention. When Joe was drafted, Dorothy stayed in their Manhattan apartment alone. Being married to Joe DiMaggio wasn't easy. He was famous, wealthy, and admired by millions of fans. But he was also quiet, serious, and often distant. Dorothy felt lonely even when they were together. Joe's Army service made things worse. He could only come home to New York a few times a year. Dorothy spent most of her time by herself in their expensive apartment, feeling forgotten and abandoned. That's when Phil Rizzuto started visiting her. Phil was Joe's closest friend on the Yankees. They had played together since 1941. Phil was the team's shortstop, a small but talented player who was known for his energy and humor. Unlike Joe, Phil was outgoing and funny. He could make people laugh. He had a warm personality that made everyone feel comfortable around him. When Joe was stationed in California, Phil would stop by the DiMaggio apartment to check on Dorothy. At first, it was innocent. Phil was just being a good friend, making sure Joe's wife was okay while he was away serving his country. "How are you doing, Dorothy?" Phil would ask. "Do you need anything? Joe asked me to look after you." Dorothy appreciated the visits. Phil would bring her flowers, take her to dinner, and listen to her problems. He was kind and attentive in ways that Joe had never been. Slowly, their friendship became something more. By February 1944, Phil was visiting Dorothy 3 times a week. They would have dinner together, go to movies, and talk for hours. Dorothy began to look forward to Phil's visits more than she looked forward to Joe's rare phone calls from California. Phil was falling in love with Dorothy. She was everything he had ever wanted in a woman: beautiful, sophisticated, and married to his best friend. Dorothy was also developing feelings for Phil. He made her feel special and wanted. He gave her the attention and affection that Joe never provided. In March 1944, their relationship crossed a line. Dorothy had invited Phil over for dinner on a rainy Thursday night. They had been drinking wine and talking about their dreams and fears. "I miss having someone to talk to," Dorothy said. "Joe never talks to me. Even when he's here, he's always thinking about baseball." Phil moved closer to her on the couch. "You deserve better than that, Dorothy. You deserve someone who appreciates you." "Someone like who?" Dorothy asked. Phil looked into her eyes. "Someone like me." That night, Phil kissed Dorothy for the first time. She didn't resist. In fact, she had been hoping it would happen for weeks. From that moment on, they were having an affair. Phil would come to the apartment whenever he could. Sometimes during the day when he wasn't at the ballpark. Sometimes late at night after games. They would make dinner together, talk about their feelings, and pretend they were a normal couple. Dorothy felt alive for the first time in years. Phil made her laugh. He made her feel beautiful and desired. He was everything Joe wasn't. Phil felt guilty about betraying Joe, but he couldn't stay away from Dorothy. He was completely in love with her. He started to believe that Dorothy deserved to be with someone who truly cared about her. They talked about what would happen when Joe came home from the war. "I want to leave Joe and be with you," Dorothy told Phil one evening in May. "Are you sure?" Phil asked. "Joe is my best friend. This will destroy him." "He doesn't love me the way you do," Dorothy said. "He married me because I looked good next to him at public events. You married me because you want to be with me." Phil knew Dorothy was right. Joe had always treated their marriage like a business arrangement. He wanted a beautiful wife who would make him look good, but he didn't want the emotional intimacy of a real relationship. By June 1944, Phil and Dorothy were making plans for their future together. They would wait until Joe returned from military service. Then Dorothy would ask for a divorce. Once she was free, she and Phil would get married and start a new life together. But they never got the chance to control how Joe found out. June 15, 1944, Joe DiMaggio had been given a 3-day leave from the army. He decided to surprise Dorothy by coming home to New York without telling her in advance. Joe took a train from California to New York. The journey took 3 days. He was excited to see his wife and spend time with her. He had been thinking about their relationship during his months in the military. He wanted to try to be a better husband. Joe arrived at Penn Station at 6:30 p.m. He took a taxi to his Manhattan apartment building. He was carrying a small suitcase and a bouquet of flowers he had bought for Dorothy. Joe used his key to unlock the front door. The apartment was quiet, but he could see lights on in the living room. "Dorothy, I'm home," Joe called out. But as Joe walked into the living room, he saw something that stopped him cold. Dorothy was sitting on the couch with Phil Rizzuto. They were kissing passionately. Phil's hands were in Dorothy's hair. Dorothy had her arms around Phil's neck. For a moment, Joe couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. His wife was betraying him with his best friend. The two people he trusted most in the world had been lying to him for months. Joe dropped the flowers. The sound made Dorothy and Phil look up. Dorothy screamed when she saw Joe standing in the doorway. Phil jumped off the couch and stared at his teammate with shock and horror. "Joe," Phil stammered. "I can explain." "Explain what?" Joe's voice was cold and quiet. "Explain how you've been sleeping with my wife while I've been serving my country." Dorothy started crying. "Joe, I'm sorry. We didn't mean for this to happen." "Didn't mean for this to happen?" Joe was getting angrier. "You didn't mean to invite my best friend into our home? You didn't mean to kiss him on our couch?" Phil tried to step forward. "Joe, listen to me. We fell in love. We couldn't help it." Joe looked at Phil with disgust. "We've been friends for 3 years. I trusted you. I asked you to look after my wife, and you seduced her." "It wasn't like that," Phil protested. "Dorothy was lonely. You were never here for her." "So that gives you the right to steal her?" Joe shouted. Dorothy wiped her tears. "Joe, our marriage has been over for a long time. You know that. We haven't been happy together." "That doesn't matter," Joe said. "We made a commitment. We took vows, and you broke them with my teammate." Joe stared at Phil, his closest friend on the Yankees. They had played hundreds of games together. They had celebrated victories and mourned defeats. Phil had been like a brother to him. "How long has this been going on?" Joe demanded. Dorothy and Phil looked at each other. Neither wanted to answer. "How long?" Joe shouted. "Since March," Dorothy whispered. Joe felt sick. For 3 months while he was serving in the army, his wife and his best friend had been betraying him. Every time he had called home, Dorothy had lied to him. Every time he had talked to Phil at team events, Phil had lied to him. "Get out," Joe said to Phil. "Joe, let me explain. Get out of my house. Get out right now." Phil looked at Dorothy, then back at Joe. He knew there was nothing he could say that would fix this situation. Phil picked up his jacket and walked toward the door. As he passed Joe, he tried to speak. "Joe, I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." Joe grabbed Phil by the shirt and shoved him against the wall. "You're sorry?" Joe's face was inches from Phil's. "You've been having an affair with my wife for 3 months, and you're sorry?" Phil was scared. He had never seen Joe this angry. "If you ever come near Dorothy again, I'll kill you," Joe said. "If you ever speak to me again, I'll kill you. You are dead to me." Joe let go of Phil and stepped back. Phil straightened his shirt and walked out the door without saying another word. Joe turned to Dorothy, who was still crying on the couch. "Why?" Joe asked. "Why did you do this to us?" "Because you don't love me," Dorothy said. "You married me because I'm pretty and because it looked good for your image, but you don't actually care about me as a person." Joe sat down in a chair across from Dorothy. He was exhausted and heartbroken. "That's not true," Joe said quietly. "I do love you." "No, you don't," Dorothy replied. "When you're home, you watch baseball games on TV or read sports magazines. You never ask me about my day or my feelings. You treat me like a piece of furniture." Joe realized that Dorothy was partly right. He had never been good at showing his emotions. He had always assumed that providing for Dorothy financially was enough to prove his love. "I can change," Joe said. "I can be a better husband." Dorothy shook her head. "It's too late, Joe. I'm in love with Phil." "Phil doesn't love you," Joe said angrily. "He just wanted to hurt me. He's jealous of my success." "That's not true," Dorothy protested. "Phil loves me more than you ever have. He listens to me. He makes me feel important." Joe stared at his wife. He realized that their marriage had been broken for a long time, but he had been too busy with his career to notice. "Do you want a divorce?" Joe asked. Dorothy nodded. "Yes, I want to be with Phil." Joe felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. His marriage was over. His friendship with Phil was over. His friendship with Phil was over. His perfect life was falling apart. "Fine," Joe said. "I'll have my lawyer contact you tomorrow." Joe stood up and walked to the bedroom. He packed a small bag with clothes and personal items. Dorothy watched him from the doorway. "Where will you go?" Dorothy asked. "Hotel," Joe said without looking at her. "Joe, I'm sorry it happened this way. I never wanted to hurt you." Joe finally looked at his wife. "But you did hurt me. You and Phil both hurt me more than anyone ever has." Joe walked out of the apartment that night and never returned. The next day, newspapers across the country reported that Joe DiMaggio and Dorothy Arnold were getting divorced. The official reason given was irreconcilable differences. None of the reporters knew about Phil Rizzuto's affair with Dorothy. Joe made sure the real story never became public. He didn't want to embarrass Dorothy or destroy Phil's career, but privately Joe was devastated by the betrayal. Joe's teammates on the Yankees noticed that something had changed about him. He had always been serious and focused, but now he seemed angry and distant. His performance on the field remained excellent, but his personality was different. "Joe's been acting strange lately," Yankees catcher Bill Dickey told manager Joe McCarthy. "He barely talks to anyone, and he seems angry all the time." McCarthy had noticed the same thing. Joe had always been a natural leader on the team, but now he kept to himself. The only person Joe seemed to actively avoid was Phil Rizzuto. When McCarthy asked Joe about his relationship with Phil, Joe gave him a cold stare. "Phil and I are teammates," Joe said. "That's all we need to be." McCarthy didn't push the issue, but he could tell that something serious had happened between the two players. Joe returned to the Army base in California to finish his military service. He spent the next several months trying to process what had happened to his marriage and his friendship. During his remaining time in the Army, Joe threw himself into his duties. He worked longer hours than required and volunteered for extra assignments. Staying busy helped him avoid thinking about Dorothy and Phil. Joe's fellow soldiers noticed that he never talked about his wife anymore. Before the betrayal, Joe would often mention Dorothy in conversations. He would show pictures of her to other soldiers and talk about their plans for after the war. Now Joe never mentioned Dorothy at all. If other soldiers asked about her, Joe would change the subject immediately. DiMaggio used to talk about his wife all the time, one soldier told another. Now he acts like she doesn't exist. I wonder what happened. Meanwhile, Dorothy and Phil continued their relationship in secret. They couldn't be seen together in public because the divorce proceedings were still ongoing and because Phil was still Joe's teammate, but they spent as much time together as possible in private. Dorothy rented a small apartment in Queens under a false name. Phil would visit her there after Yankees games, and on days off, they would cook dinner together, listen to music on the radio, and talk about their future. Phil felt terrible about hurting Joe, but he was also deeply in love with Dorothy. He believed that he and Dorothy had a real emotional connection that Joe and Dorothy had never shared. "Joe never understood you the way I do," Phil would tell Dorothy. "He married you because you were beautiful, but he never tried to know who you really are." Dorothy agreed. "Joe treated me like a trophy wife. You treat me like a person." But their secret relationship was stressful. They had to be careful about when and where they met. They couldn't go to restaurants or movies together because someone might recognize them and tell reporters. Dorothy missed the glamorous lifestyle she had enjoyed as Joe DiMaggio's wife. She had been invited to Hollywood parties and Broadway premieres. Now she was hiding in a small apartment in Queens. Phil was also feeling the pressure. At Yankees games, he had to pretend that everything was normal. He had to act like he and Joe were still friends while knowing that he had betrayed Joe in the worst possible way. The guilt was eating at Phil. Every time he made a good play at shortstop, he remembered how Joe used to congratulate him after games. Every time the Yankees won, he remembered how he and Joe used to celebrate together. Now Joe wouldn't even look at him. In September 1944, Joe's divorce from Dorothy was finalized. She received a large financial settlement and kept the Manhattan apartment. The divorce made headlines in newspapers across the country, but most articles focused on Joe's military service and baseball career. "America's hero gets divorced," read one headline in the New York Daily News. "DiMaggio's marriage ends while he serves his country." The articles portrayed Joe as the victim of a wife who couldn't handle being married to a man serving in the military. None of the reporters suspected that Dorothy had been having an affair. Dorothy was relieved when the divorce was finalized. Now she could be seen in public with Phil without worrying about legal complications. But Phil was more nervous than ever. "Now that you're divorced, people are going to wonder who you're dating," Phil told Dorothy. "If they find out it's me, they'll realize I was the reason for your divorce." Dorothy tried to reassure him. "We'll be careful. And even if people find out, so what? You're both adults. You have the right to be together." But Phil knew that baseball fans and reporters wouldn't see it that way. If the truth came out, he would be portrayed as the villain who destroyed America's sweetheart couple. Joe returned to the Yankees in 1945 when his military service ended. Phil was still on the team, playing shortstop. The first day Joe returned to Yankee Stadium, Phil tried to talk to him. "Joe, can we please discuss what happened?" Phil asked in the locker room. Joe looked at Phil like he was a stranger. "I have nothing to say to you. We used to be best friends," Phil said. "We can't let a woman destroy our friendship." Joe's eyes flashed with anger. "You destroyed our friendship when you decided to have an affair with my wife. Dorothy didn't force you to betray me. You chose to do it." From that day forward, Joe and Phil never spoke to each other again unless it was absolutely necessary for baseball. On the field, they continued to play together professionally. Joe played center field, Phil played shortstop. They communicated about defensive plays and strategy, but their conversations were purely business. The other Yankees players noticed the tension between Joe and Phil, but nobody knew why their friendship had ended. Joe and Phil never told anyone about the affair, but their behavior toward each other was obvious to everyone. Yankees third baseman, Red Rolfe, was one of the first to notice the change. "Joe and Phil used to be inseparable," Rolfe told his wife. "They would sit together on the train, eat meals together, and talk constantly about baseball strategy. Now they act like they're enemies." Yankees pitcher Red Ruffing also noticed the hostility. "Something happened between Joe and Phil during the war," Ruffing told Yankees coach Art Fletcher. "They used to be best friends, but now they can't stand to be in the same room together." The tension affected the entire team. Joe and Phil had been the emotional leaders of the Yankees before the war. Their friendship had helped create a positive atmosphere in the clubhouse. Now their mutual hatred created an uncomfortable environment for everyone. Manager Joe McCarthy tried to address the situation privately. "Whatever happened between you and Phil, you need to work it out," McCarthy told Joe after practice one day. "This team needs both of you to be leaders." Joe's response was ice cold. "Phil and I will do our jobs on the field. That's all that matters." McCarthy also talked to Phil, who was more emotional about the situation. "I made a terrible mistake," Phil told McCarthy. "I hurt Joe badly, and he'll never forgive me. I don't blame him for hating me." McCarthy didn't ask for details, but he could tell that whatever had happened between Joe and Phil was serious and personal. In the locker room, Joe ignored Phil completely. If Phil entered a conversation, Joe would leave. If Phil tried to make a joke, Joe wouldn't laugh. If Phil needed to discuss defensive strategy, Joe would communicate through other players rather than talking to Phil directly. Phil was miserable. He was playing on the same team as his former best friend, but he felt more alone than ever. The guilt of betraying Joe was consuming him, and Joe's coldness was a constant reminder of what he had lost. Yankees outfielder Tommy Henrich tried to mediate between Joe and Phil. "You guys used to be great friends," Henrich told them both separately. "Whatever happened, maybe you can work it out." Joe's response was final. "Some things can't be worked out, Tommy. Some betrayals can't be forgiven." Phil was more open about his regret. "I lost the best friend I ever had," he told Henrich. "I made a choice that I'll regret for the rest of my life." Phil's relationship with Dorothy didn't last long after the divorce. By December 1944, Phil realized that he and Dorothy didn't have as much in common as he had thought. Without the excitement of their secret affair, their relationship became ordinary and difficult. Dorothy was used to being married to Joe DiMaggio, one of the most famous athletes in America. Phil was a good baseball player, but he wasn't a superstar. Dorothy missed the glamour and attention that came with being Joe's wife. Phil also felt guilty about betraying Joe. Every time he looked at Dorothy, he was reminded of how he had hurt his former best friend. In January 1945, Phil and Dorothy ended their relationship. Dorothy moved to California to pursue her acting career. Phil remained in New York with the Yankees. Phil tried several times over the years to apologize to Joe and rebuild their friendship. He wrote letters. He asked other players to intervene, and he even tried to approach Joe directly. Joe refused every attempt at reconciliation. "What Phil did to me was unforgivable," Joe told his brother Dom. I trusted him with the most important thing in my life, and he betrayed that trust. I can never forget that." Joe and Phil continued to play together on the Yankees until 1951, when Phil's career ended. For 7 years they maintained their professional relationship while completely ignoring each other personally. The Yankees won 4 World Series championships during those years, but Joe never celebrated with Phil. Even during the team's biggest victories, Joe would avoid Phil at all costs. Other players noticed Joe's coldness toward Phil, but nobody understood the reason. Joe was friendly with everyone else on the team, but he treated Phil like he didn't exist. In 1951, Phil retired from baseball and became a broadcaster for Yankees games. Joe retired in 1951 as well, but he avoided any team events where Phil would be present. Over the years, the story of Joe and Phil's broken friendship became a mystery in baseball circles. Sports writers and fans speculated about what had caused their rift, but nobody knew the truth. Some people guessed that they had argued about money or contracts. Others thought they had disagreed about baseball strategy. A few people suspected that a woman was involved, but nobody knew about Dorothy's affair. Joe never spoke publicly about his relationship with Phil. When reporters asked about their friendship, Joe would change the subject or give short, polite answers. "Phil was a good shortstop," Joe would say. "We played well together." But privately, Joe remained angry and hurt for the rest of his life. In 1954, Joe married Marilyn Monroe. The marriage lasted less than a year, but it made Joe even more famous than he had been before. Phil got married in 1949 to a woman named Cora. They had a happy marriage that lasted until Phil's death in 2007. Throughout their lives, Joe and Phil occasionally encountered each other at Yankees old-timers games and other baseball events. They would nod politely if they made eye contact, but they never spoke. In 1999, Joe DiMaggio died at age 84. Phil attended Joe's funeral, but he sat in the back of the church and left immediately after the service. Phil never got the chance to apologize to Joe in person. He regretted the affair with Dorothy for the rest of his life, not because he didn't love her, but because it cost him his friendship with one of the greatest players in baseball history. After Joe's death, Phil was interviewed by several sports journalists who asked about his relationship with Joe. "Joe DiMaggio was a great player and a good man," Phil would say. "I have nothing but respect for him." Phil never admitted publicly to having an affair with Dorothy. He took that secret to his grave when he died in 2007 at age 89. Dorothy Arnold died in 1984 in California. She never remarried after her divorce from Joe. In her later years, she occasionally gave interviews to entertainment reporters who asked about her marriage to Joe DiMaggio. "Joe was a complicated man," Dorothy would say. "He was a great baseball player, but he had trouble expressing his emotions. Our marriage ended because we wanted different things from life." Dorothy never mentioned her affair with Phil Rizzuto in any of her interviews. Today, Joe DiMaggio and Phil Rizzuto are both remembered as Yankees legends. Joe is considered one of the greatest players in baseball history. Phil is remembered as an excellent defensive shortstop and a beloved broadcaster. But for those who knew both men personally, their story serves as a reminder that even the strongest friendships can be destroyed by betrayal, and that some wounds never heal completely. The affair between Phil Rizzuto and Dorothy Arnold lasted only a few months, but its effects lasted for decades. It ended a marriage, destroyed a friendship, and left emotional scars on everyone involved. Joe DiMaggio learned a painful lesson about trust that night in June 1944. He discovered that the people closest to you are capable of causing the deepest hurt, and that some betrayals can never be forgiven or forgotten. For Phil Rizzuto, the affair taught him that love built on betrayal rarely lasts, and that a moment of weakness can cost you a lifetime of friendship. The story of Joe DiMaggio's broken marriage and destroyed friendship remains one of baseball's most tragic tales of personal loss, serving as a reminder that fame and success mean nothing if you don't have people you can trust. If this story of betrayal, heartbreak, and the price of broken trust moved you, subscribe for more untold stories of how sports legends faced their greatest personal challenges. Like this video if you believe Joe was right to never forgive Phil's betrayal, and comment below, could you forgive your best friend if they had an affair with your spouse? Next week we're revealing another story of how personal betrayal destroyed a sports friendship and changed 2 careers forever. Remember, trust is the foundation of every relationship, but once it's broken, some friendships can never be repaired, and some pain never goes away.